The Salt River don't care much for schedules. It runs when the mountain snow says run, floods when the spring rains say flood, and on that particular afternoon in the summer of '78, it decided to test a man named Caleb Marsden. He'd been mending fence wire along the creek bank. Same work he'd done for 20 years, same silence, same dust settling on his shoulders like an old familiar coat. The creak of wire under tension was the only conversation he'd had all week. Then he heard it. Not a scream exactly, more like the gasp of someone fighting water and losing. By the time he reached the crossing, she was barely holding on. A young Apache woman, dark hair streaming behind her, clutching a leather satchel to her chest like it mattered more than breathing. Whatever was in that satchel would burn down half the territory. But Caleb didn't know that yet. Caleb didn't think, didn't weigh the cost or measure the risk. He just moved. The creek had swollen, angry, and brown, churning with debris from upstream. The woman thrashed in the current, one arm wrapped around a cottonwood root, the other clutching that leather satchel above the waterline. Her face broke the surface, gasped, went under again. He hit the water at a run. The cold shocked through his boots, his trousers, climbing toward his chest as the creek bottom dropped away. Current dragged at his legs like hands trying to pull him down. He fought through it, arms cutting the murky water until his fingers found fabric. She fought him at first. Instinct, he reckoned, fear. Her elbow caught his jaw and he tasted copper. But he got his arm around her waist and hauled her toward the bank, boots scraping for purchase on the slick stones beneath. They broke the surface together, both of them coughing, spitting creek water. He dragged her up onto the sand and collapsed beside her, chest heaving, the smell of mud and wet leather thick in his throat. That's when he saw her dress, torn near to rags, the fabric plastered against her skin, hiding nothing. Caleb turned away so fast he nearly fell back in the river. "Easy," he said, voice rough from the water. "I ain't looking." He kept his back to her, staring at the far bank, at the cottonwoods swaying in the wind. His hands fumbled with the buttons of his work shirt, the faded blue one, soft from 100 washings. He shrugged it off and held it behind him, arm extended. "Take this. Cover yourself." Silence. Just her ragged breathing and the rush of the creek, then the whisper of fabric leaving his fingers. He waited, counted to 20, heard her struggling to stand, heard her stumble and catch herself. "You can turn," she said. Her voice surprised him, clear, steady, not the broken sound of someone who'd nearly drowned. He turned slow, keeping his eyes on her face. She stood wrapped in his shirt, the hem falling past her thighs, the sleeves hanging over her hands. She was young, late 20s maybe, with sharp cheekbones and eyes dark as river stones. Apache, no question about it, and still clutching that satchel like her life depended on it. Maybe it did. "Can you walk?" he asked. She took a step, her legs buckled. He caught her before she hit the sand, one arm under her shoulders, the other hooked behind her knees. "My cabin's close," he said. "You'll be safe there." Those dark eyes studied him, searching for threat, for deception, for whatever cruelty she expected from a white man on the frontier. He let her look, let her see whatever she needed to see. She didn't release the satchel, not even when he lifted her. Her fingers stayed locked around the leather strap, knuckles pale with effort. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and coffee gone cold. Caleb set her in the chair by the hearth and backed away, giving her the space she clearly needed. She tracked his every movement, a wounded animal watching for the trap to spring. He built up the fire without speaking. The dry wood caught quick, crackling and popping, sending warmth into the room. He found a blanket, wool, scratchy but clean, and set it on the table within her reach. "There's food if you're hungry, water in the pitcher." She didn't move toward either. "Why?" The word came sharp, almost accusatory. "Why what?" "Why help me?" Caleb poked at the fire, watched the sparks spiral upward. "Seemed like you needed it." "You do not know me. You do not know what I carry." He turned then, met her gaze straight on. "Reckon that's your business, not mine." Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the sharp edge of her suspicion dulled just a fraction. She touched the satchel, fingers tracing the worn leather. "These papers," she said slowly, "could destroy powerful men, men who would kill to keep them buried." The fire popped. Outside, a hawk cried somewhere over the mesa. "What kind of papers?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into the satchel and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age, edges soft from handling. She spread it on the table between them. A map, survey lines and boundary markers, official stamps and signatures. "This is the true survey of my people's land," she said. 40 square miles along the Sibicu, promised by treaty. Stolen by men who changed the documents after they were filed. Caleb leaned closer, reading the faded script. His stomach dropped when he saw the signature at the bottom. Daniel Marsden, surveyor's assistant, his father's name, his father's hand. The woman's voice came quiet now, but steady as stone. "Your name is Marsden. Your father surveyed our land." The fire crackled. The coffee sat cold, and Caleb felt the ground shift beneath his feet, solid as it had seemed that morning, now uncertain as river sand. Whatever his father had done, or been made to do, it had just walked through his door wrapped in his own shirt. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on a man's shoulders. Caleb left Ayanna sleeping by the fire, her breathing finally even, her grip on that satchel loosened just enough to suggest something close to rest. He needed supplies. More than that, he needed to know what the town was saying. The ride into Ridgeback Township took the better part of an hour. Dust kicked up behind his horse's hooves, and the smell of sage and dry earth filled his lungs. By the time he hitched his mare outside Delgado's general store, he already felt the weight of watching eyes. The bell above the door jangled as he entered. 2 men at the counter stopped mid-conversation. A woman examining bolts of fabric turned away, suddenly fascinated by calico patterns she'd seen 100 times before. Luisa Delgado stood behind the counter, her weathered face betraying nothing. She was 58 years old, widowed 6 years now, and she'd seen enough of this territory's ugliness to recognize trouble when it walked through her door. "Mr. Marsden?" Her voice carried the faint music of her Mexican heritage. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee, flour, whatever salted meat you've got." She moved along the shelves, gathering his order with practiced efficiency. The other customers drifted toward the door, their silence louder than any accusation. When they were alone, Louisa leaned across the counter. The smell of dried chilies and old wood surrounded her. "Word travels fast out here," she said quietly. "Ain't done nothing wrong." "Didn't say you did." Her dark eyes held his. "But Vernon Slade was asking questions before sunrise? About you, about your guest." Caleb's jaw tightened. Slade worked as Judge Hollister's right hand. Everyone in the territory knew it. The man had a gift for acquiring land that didn't belong to him, and the judge had a gift for making the paperwork look proper. "What kind of questions?" Louisa glanced toward the window, checking the street. He wanted to know what she was carrying, offered $200 for anything she brought with her. $200, more than most ranchers saw in a year. More than anyone would pay for simple curiosity. That's a lot of money for documents nobody's supposed to care about. Louisa's hand found his on the counter, her grip surprisingly strong. "My husband filed a land contest 8 years ago. Same office, same judge." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They said Manuel fell from his horse, but my husband rode better than any man I ever knew." The bell above the door jangled. Louisa pulled back, her expression smoothing into the pleasant mask of a shopkeeper. Caleb gathered his supplies, paid in coin, and stepped back into the dust and heat of the street. Whatever Ayanna carried in that satchel, powerful men wanted it buried, and they'd bury anyone who got in the way. 3 days later, Caleb made his decision. "We file the claim," he told Ayanna. "Make it official. Force them to respond in the open." She looked at him like he'd suggested walking into a rattlesnake den. "Hollister controls the land office." "He controls it, but he don't own the law. There's a process. We follow it. We create a record, something they can't just make disappear." The ride into town felt different with her beside him. The stares came harder now, the whispers sharper. Someone spat in the dust as they passed the saloon. The land office occupied a squat adobe building at the end of Main Street. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper, and the floorboards creaked beneath their boots. Judge Emery Hollister sat behind a desk of polished oak, his silver hair catching the light from the window. He was 61 years old, well-fed, and comfortable in his power, the way a king is comfortable on his throne. Vernon Slade stood at his shoulder, lean as a coyote, smiling the way a man smiles when he knows the game is rigged. "Mr. Marsden." Hollister didn't rise, and guessed. "What brings you to my office?" Ayanna stepped forward, her chin high, and placed her documents on the desk. "I am filing a formal contest of land patents issued through this office. 40 square miles along the Cibecue, promised to my people by treaty, stolen through fraudulent surveys." Hollister examined the papers with the unhurried patience of a man who had all the time in the world. His expression never changed. "These documents are irregular." He set them down carefully. "The survey markings don't match our territorial records." "Because your records are forged." Silence. Slade's smile widened. Hollister folded his hands. "That's a serious accusation. You have 14 days to file a formal contest, assuming you can find legal representation, proper witnesses, and the filing fee. $14. "I'll pay it," Caleb said. "Unfortunately, the office is closed for documentation review." Hollister spread his hands in mock regret. "Come back in 2 weeks." The door shut behind them, with the sound of a cell closing. Outside, Ayanna turned to face him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "Your father surveyed that land, Caleb. His name is on the original map, the true one before they changed it. They used his honest work to make their theft look legal. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, and Caleb understood that his father's name, his family's name, had been twisted into a weapon against the very people it should have protected. 13 days remained, and every legal path ran straight through the man who'd built his fortune on stolen ground. The knock came after midnight. Caleb grabbed his rifle before his boots hit the floor. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in shades of red and shadow. Ayanna was already awake, pressed against the wall beside the window, her satchel clutched to her chest. He moved to the door, rifle raised, and listened. The knock came again, soft, deliberate. Not the pounding of men who meant violence. "Who's there?" "Luisa Delgado. I am alone." He cracked the door an inch. Moonlight fell across her face, tired, drawn, wrapped in a dark shawl that made her nearly invisible against the night. He scanned the yard behind her. Empty, just the whisper of wind through the sage and the distant call of a coyote. He let her in. She moved past him quickly, and he caught the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs clinging to her clothes. Her eyes found Ayanna immediately, studied her for a long moment, then softened with something that looked like recognition. "You are Grey Wolf's granddaughter," Luisa said. "I knew your grandmother. She traded with my mother when I was a girl." Ayanna's grip on the satchel loosened, just slightly. "You knew her?" "She was a woman of great dignity. I wept when I heard she had passed." The fire popped. Embers scattered across the hearthstones. Caleb set the rifle against the wall but stayed close to it. "You didn't ride out here in the middle of the night to share memories," he said. Luisa turned to face him, and the exhaustion in her eyes gave way to something harder. "No, I came to warn you, and to help, if you'll let me." She settled into the chair Caleb offered, her hands folded in her lap. The moonlight through the window caught the silver threads in her dark hair. "I told you my husband filed a contest," she began. "What I did not tell you is what happened after." The cabin fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Manuel gathered evidence for 3 months. Testimonies from other families who had lost their land. Old surveys that didn't match the official records. He was careful, patient. He trusted the law to protect him. Her voice caught. "He was a fool, and so was I, for believing with him." Ayanna moved closer, sat on the edge of the hearth. "What did they do?" "First, the threats. Men watching our home. Our cattle found dead in the fields. Then the fire, our barn, everything inside." Luisa's hands tightened in her lap. Manuel would not stop. He said the truth was worth more than fear. She drew a breath. The smell of the dying fire filled the silence. They found him at the bottom of Coyote Canyon. His horse came home without him. The sheriff said he must have ridden too close to the edge in the dark. Her eyes met Caleb's, bright with old grief and present anger. But Manuel knew that trail better than he knew his own face in the mirror. He would never have fallen. Caleb felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. This wasn't just about land or money. Men had died for what Ayanna carried in that satchel. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. Luisa reached into the folds of her shawl and withdrew an iron key, old and heavy, dark with age. She pressed it into Ayanna's palm. "Father Morales at the mission church. He is old, nearly blind, but his heart is true. He owes me a debt from many years ago. I saved his sister's life during the fever outbreak of '62. She closed Ayanna's fingers around the key. "He will keep your documents behind the altar. The church is sacred ground. Even Hollister would hesitate to defile it openly." Ayanna looked at the key, then at Luisa. "Why would you risk this? You've already lost so much." Because my husband died trying to do what you are doing. Because I am tired of being afraid." And Luisa's chin lifted. "And because if I do nothing, I am no better than the men who killed him." The coyote called again, closer now. Caleb moved to the window, checked the darkness beyond. Still empty, still safe. For now. "There are others," Luisa said, rising to leave. "Other families who lost land. Mexican, Apache, small ranchers, anyone without power to fight back. They are afraid to speak, but they remember. When the time comes, they may find their courage." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "And there is one more thing. Samuel Whitmore, the old lawyer who lives at the edge of town. He has been watching you, Caleb. I have seen him on his porch when you ride past. He knows something. I am certain of it." "A Whitmore?" Caleb frowned. "He hasn't practiced law in years. Keeps to himself." "Yes, and perhaps there is a reason for that." Luisa pulled her shawl tight against the night air. "Ask him, before it is too late." She slipped into the darkness, and Caleb watched until she disappeared beyond the ridge, just another shadow swallowed by the desert night. Ayanna stood beside him, the iron key still warm in her palm. A church, a widow, a silent old man. She shook her head slowly. These are strange allies for a fight like this. Caleb thought of his father's signature on that forged survey. Thought of Manuel Delgado at the bottom of a canyon. Thought of all the people who'd lost everything to men who believed the law belonged to whoever could afford to twist it. Strange allies are better than none, he said. 12 days remained, and somewhere in that dying town, an old man with secrets was watching from his porch, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The next morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of morning that made a man believe the world was simpler than it was. Caleb and Ayanna rode out early to check the fence line along the north boundary, where the property met the open range leading toward the mesa. She was stronger now. The trembling that had racked her body those first days had steadied into something quieter, more controlled. She rode the spare horse like she'd been born to it, her back straight, her eyes scanning the horizon with the watchfulness of someone who'd learned that danger could come from any direction. They worked in comfortable silence, him checking the wire tension, her handing him tools from the saddlebag. The creak of leather and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk were the only sounds. The air smelled of dust and sage, warm and dry against his skin. It was Ayanna who saw them first. Caleb. Her voice was soft, but something in it made him straighten immediately. Look. She pointed toward the corner post, where his property line met the old survey marker his father had helped set 25 years ago, except the marker wasn't where it should be. He walked toward it slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. A fresh survey stake jutted from the ground, iron, painted red, driven deep, professional work, recent work. The stake stood 40 feet inside his property line. That ain't right, he muttered. He crouched beside it, ran his fingers over the cold metal. The iron was still warm from the forge. Someone had planted this within the last day or two. Ayanna knelt beside him, examining the markings. Same stamps as the fall surveys on our land. Same hand. Caleb stood, looking along the fence line toward the creek. If these stakes held, if someone filed a claim based on these new markers, he'd lose his water access. The creek that fed his stock, irrigated his small garden, kept this land alive through the brutal summer months. Without water rights, the ranch was worthless. A man could survive a lot of things out here, but not a dry well in a dead creek. They're not just trying to stop you, Ayanna said quietly. She rose, brushing dust from her hands. They're trying to stop you from helping me. He pulled the stake from the ground with a grunt of effort. The iron left a dark hole in the earth, raw and ugly. Someone drove this in while we were in town yesterday. They're watching us, tracking every move we make. Ayanna took the stake from him, turned it over in her hands. The message is clear. Help me, and lose everything you've built. Caleb stared at the hole in the ground, at the fence line his father had strung when Caleb was still a boy, learning to sit a horse. 20 years of work, 20 years of sweat and solitude and stubborn hope, all of it balanced on a knife's edge now. Let's get back to the cabin, he said. There's something I need to show you. That night, the fire crackled low in the hearth. Caleb had spread his father's old survey journal on the table, alongside the documents from Ayanna's satchel. 2 maps, 2 versions of the truth. The smell of wood smoke and old paper filled the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters with restless fingers. This is my father's work, Caleb said, pointing to the journal entries. Every survey he assisted on, recorded in his own hand. Measurements, landmarks, dates. He was meticulous about it. Said a man's word was only as good as his records. Ayanna leaned close, studying the faded script. These numbers are different from the official patents. That's what I'm seeing too. He flipped to a specific page, marked with a corner fold so old the paper had turned soft. Here, the Cibiq survey, summer of '53. The measurements were precise, written in his father's careful hand. Boundary lines marked with compass headings. Corner posts noted by landmark, a lightning-struck pine, a red rock formation, the bend in the creek where the water ran deep and slow. Ayanna unfolded her own map, the one from her grandmother's satchel, and laid it beside the journal. The lines matched, exactly. Your father recorded the true boundaries, she said, the same ones promised to my people by treaty. Someone changed them after he filed. Caleb's voice came rough. Used his honest work as a foundation, then built lies on top of it. Ayanna traced the survey lines with her finger, her expression unreadable. Then she reached for another document, one she hadn't shown him before. Older, more fragile, the edges brown with age. This is the original land grant, she said, signed by the territorial governor in '48, before the war, before Hollister. She spread it on the table, and Caleb felt the ground shift beneath him. The boundary lines on the grant encompassed not just the Apache territory along the Cibiq, they extended south, past the mesa, past the ridge, directly through the land where his cabin stood. "No," he breathed. "Your ranch sits on Apache land, Caleb." Ayanna's voice was steady, but her eyes held something that might have been sorrow. "The patent your father helped survey, it was part of the same theft. Hollister carved up the original grant and sold the pieces to settlers who didn't know any better." The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward like dying stars. "If your claim succeeds," Caleb said slowly, the words like stones in his mouth, "my deed becomes invalid. Yes, I lose everything. Yes." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floorboards, walked to the window, stared out at the darkness where his land, his father's land, stretched toward the horizon he couldn't see. 20 years, every fence post, every water trough, every morning spent mending what the desert tried to break. All of it built on a lie he'd never known. "I didn't know," Ayanna said behind him. "Not until I saw the boundaries today. Your father's name. I knew he'd surveyed the land, but I didn't realize how far the theft extended. My pa was an honest man." His voice cracked on the words. He didn't know. They used him, just like they used everyone who trusted the system to be fair. Caleb pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. His breath fogged the pain. To help her meant losing the only thing his family had left him. The land that held his parents' graves. The cabin, where his brother had taken his first steps. Every memory, every ghost, every reason he'd stayed when leaving would have been easier. But to stay silent meant becoming part of the lie. Becoming no different from the men who'd built their fortunes on stolen ground and broken promises. He thought of Luis's husband at the bottom of a canyon. Thought of Ayanna clutching that satchel in the river, willing to drown before she let it go. Thought of his father's careful handwriting in that journal, honest measurements made by honest hands. Paper don't make a home, he thought. The land don't care whose name is on a deed. He turned from the window, met Ayanna's eyes. "We filed a claim," he said, "the true one. Your people's land restored no matter what it costs me." She stared at him. "You would give up everything?" "I'd rather lose this ranch doing right than keep it knowing it was built on a lie." The fire burned low, the wind rattled the shutters. And somewhere in the darkness, men who thought they owned the law were about to learn that some things couldn't be bought or stolen or forged. Some things had to be earned. The barn door groaned on its hinges, protesting the early morning intrusion. Caleb hadn't been in this corner of the building in years, hadn't had reason to disturb the things his father left behind. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light that fell through gaps in the roof boards, and the smell of old leather and dry hay wrapped around him like a memory. 9 days remained on the filing deadline. 9 days to build a case against the most powerful man in the territory. Ayanna waited near the door, watching as he moved aside crates and feed sacks that had accumulated over 2 decades of avoidance. His hands found the trunk beneath a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, a simple pine box, brass hinges green with patina. He knelt beside it, brushing away the dust. The lid resisted at first, swollen with years of humidity and neglect, then gave way with a crack that echoed through the barn. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow held against time and moisture, lay the tools of his father's trade. The measuring chains came out first, each link precisely forged, the brass fittings dull but solid. Then the surveyor's level, its bubble glass still intact, still true, iron stakes with numbered heads, a compass in a leather case, the needle swinging lazily when he opened it. And beneath them all, heavy in his palm when he lifted it, the brass plumb bob. Caleb held it up to the light. The weight was familiar. He remembered his father letting him hold it as a boy, explaining how gravity never lied, how a plumb line would always find true vertical, no matter what men tried to build around it. This was his most prized tool, Caleb said quietly. Said a man could fake a lot of things, but he couldn't fake the pull of the earth. Ayanna stepped closer, her shadow falling across the open trunk. "You know how to use these?" "My pa taught me before I could properly sit a horse. Spent 2 summers as his assistant, carrying chains and driving stakes." He turned the plumb bob in his fingers, watching light play across the worn brass. "I was 12 when I told him I wanted to be a rancher instead." He laughed, said the land would still need measuring whether I was the one doing it or not. He set the plumb bob aside and reached for the last item in the trunk, a leather-bound journal, its spine cracked, its pages soft with age. His father's survey records, written in the precise, careful script of a man who believed accuracy was a form of honesty. Caleb opened it to the Cibicue entries. The numbers matched what they'd compared the night before. Boundary lines, compass headings, landmark, references, all recorded with the methodical patience his father had brought to everything he did. "These are the true measurements," he said. "If we resurvey the disputed land using the same methods, the same reference points, we can prove the official patents don't match." Will that be enough? Your word against Hollister's records?" "By itself? Probably not." Caleb closed the journal, held it against his chest. But if Samuel Whitmore knows what Louisa thinks he knows, we might have more than just my word. He gathered the tools, wrapped them carefully in the oilcloth, and carried them out into the morning light. The sun was climbing above the eastern ridge, burning off the last of the night's chill. The smell of sage and dust filled his lungs, familiar as his own heartbeat. "First we measure," he said, "then we find the old man." They worked for 2 days, walking the boundary lines together under the endless Arizona sky. Ayanna learned quickly. She held the measuring chain taut while Caleb sighted through the level, calling out readings that she recorded in a new journal, his handwriting now, but matching his father's precision as closely as he could manage. The brass plumb bob caught the morning light each time he set a new point, swinging gently at the end of its cord until it found true vertical. There was something almost sacred about the ritual, the careful measurements, the patient verification, the slow accumulation of truth one number at a time. They started at the old lightning-struck pine his father had used as a primary reference point. The tree was dead now, bleached white by decades of sun, but still standing, a skeleton pointing at the sky. "Corner post 1, Caleb said, driving an iron stake into the ground beside it. "This matches my father's original survey exactly." From there, they followed the boundary south, measuring and marking as they went. The work was slow, deliberate. Each chain length counted, each compass heading verified twice before recording. The sun beat down on their shoulders, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain that would never arrive. At the disputed corner where the new red-painted stakes had appeared, Caleb drove his own marker 40 feet beyond. "Original boundary," he said, "man, right here. Exactly where my father recorded it 25 years ago." Ayanna compared their measurements to the documents from her satchel. The forged patents Hollister had filed, the ones that showed Apache land suddenly belonging to territorial speculators and unsuspecting settlers. "Every line is different," she said, her voice tight with vindication. "Every single one. The official records don't just adjust the boundaries, they redraw them completely. Hollister didn't just steal your people's land." Caleb wiped dust from his face, staring at the numbers they'd recorded. "He stole from every rancher who filed a patent through his office, every Mexican family, every homesteader who thought they were buying clear title." The implications settled over them both like a weight. $12,000 in fraudulent patents, Ayanna said. "Maybe more, if we can prove this at tribunal, if." Caleb gathered the survey tools, wrapped them carefully against the dust. "We still need a witness. Someone who saw the original records before they were changed. Someone who was there when the fraud was committed." They both knew who that someone was. The old lawyer hadn't spoken since that day on his porch, when he'd admitted to watching and hinted at 40 years of guilt. But the clock was ticking for him too, consumption eating away at his lungs, death waiting patient as a desert vulture. "Whitmore might not help us," Ayanna said. "He has kept silent this long. Why would he speak now?" Caleb thought about his father's journal, the honest measurements made by honest hands. Thought about the plumb bob in his pack, the tool that always found true no matter what men built around it. "Because some men spend their whole lives running from the truth," he said. "And some men, when they see the end coming, decide they'd rather face it than keep running." He helped Ayanna onto her horse, then mounted his own. The survey stakes they'd driven stood in a line across the disputed land, small iron markers against the vastness of the territory. But markers nonetheless. Evidence. Truth hammered into the ground where lies had grown like weeds. 7 days remained. Somewhere in that dying town, a man with secrets was running out of time to decide what kind of ending he wanted. The sun was setting when they rode back toward the cabin, painting the mesa in shades of gold and blood. Behind them, the brass plumb bob swung gently in its wrapping, patient and true, waiting to be used again. The saloon smelled like spilled whiskey and old regrets. Caleb pushed through the swinging doors, squinting against the dim light that filtered through windows gone yellow with tobacco smoke. He needed information about the tribunal process, who to contact in Tucson, what forms needed filing, how to request a territorial inspector. What he found was Vernon Slade waiting for him like a snake coiled in tall grass. The conversations died when Caleb entered. Card games paused mid-deal. A man at the bar suddenly found the bottom of his glass fascinating. The silence pressed against Caleb's ears, thick and hostile. Slade sat at a corner table, a half-empty bottle in front of him, and that coyote smile spreading across his lean face. He didn't stand. Didn't need to. Every man in the room knew who held power here. Marsden. Slade's voice carried through the quiet, like a stone dropped in still water. "Heard you've been playing surveyor out on the flats, stirring up old dirt." Caleb stopped near the bar, keeping distance between them. "Dirt that's been buried too long." "That so?" Slade poured himself another drink, the whiskey catching the lamplight like liquid amber. "The boys here were just discussing how a man harboring an Apache woman might be confused about his loyalties." Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone coughed. A chair scraped against the floorboards. Caleb kept his voice level. My loyalties ain't anyone's business but my own. Slade stood slowly, unfolding himself from the chair with the deliberate grace of a man who knew he was dangerous. He crossed the room until he stood close enough for Caleb to smell the whiskey on his breath, the tobacco on his clothes. 12 years I've worked land deals with Judge Hollister, Slade said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. 12 years of keeping this territory running smooth. Good men making good money. Progress. He smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. You know what happens to men who get in the way of progress, Marsden? I reckon you're about to tell me. They get forgotten. Slade's hand came up, straightened Caleb's collar in a gesture that was more threat than courtesy. Their ranches burn, their cattle scatter, their names become warnings mothers tell their children. And he leaned closer. Last chance. Hand over the woman and her papers. Walk away clean. Caleb held the man's stare. The smell of whiskey turned his stomach, but he didn't step back. And if I don't? Then I'll make sure this territory remembers your name with shame. Race traitor, Indian lover, the man who threw away everything for a savage and a stack of worthless paper. Slade's smile widened. Your choice. The saloon held its breath. Every eye watched, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Caleb reached up and removed Slade's hand from his collar. Slow, deliberate. Reckon I'd rather be remembered for standing up than for staying silent. He turned and walked out, feeling the weight of those stairs on his back like rifle sights. The swinging doors creaked behind him, and the murmur of voices rose again, but different now, uncertain. A line had been drawn, and everyone in that saloon knew which side Caleb Marsden stood on. Whitmore's cabin sat at the edge of town, half hidden by a stand of mesquite trees gone wild with neglect. The windows were dark despite the fading afternoon light, and the porch sagged under the weight of years and abandonment. Caleb tied his horse and approached slowly. The boards groaned beneath his boots, announcing his presence before he could knock. It's open. The voice from inside was thin, reedy, a sound like wind through dry grass. The door swung inward on rusted hinges. The smell hit him immediately. Medicine, dust, and something else beneath it. Something final. The sickroom smell of a body giving up its hold on life. Samuel Whitmore sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the day. He was thinner than Caleb remembered. Gaunt, really. The bones of his face pressing against skin gone gray and paper-thin. But his eyes were clear, bright with something that might have been fever, or might have been the particular clarity of a man who could see his own ending approaching. You came back, Whitmore said. Not a question. I need to know what you know. The old man laughed, which turned into a cough that shook his whole frame. When it passed, he wiped his mouth with a handkerchief that came away spotted with red. What I know. He stared at the blood on the cloth. I know I'm dying with more sins on my soul than any man should carry. I know I've spent 40 years watching good people lose everything while I kept my head down and my mouth shut. Luisa Delgado's husband, Manuel. Whitmore closed his eyes. A good man, an honest man. He came to me for help with his land contest. I told him I couldn't get involved. His voice cracked. 3 weeks later, they found him at the bottom of Coyote Canyon. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Dust motes drifted through the fading light. The fraudulent patents, Caleb said. You wrote them. Whitmore's eyes opened, met his. No denial, no excuse. Everyone. Hollister told me what boundaries to record. Slade paid me $20 per filing. As his hands trembled on the armrests of his chair. I was a coward, had debts, had fear. Told myself the land didn't really belong to anyone who mattered. But it did. Yes. The word came out broken. It belonged to people who couldn't fight back. Apache families, Mexican settlers, small ranchers who trusted the system to be fair. Whitmore struggled to his feet, shuffling toward a corner of the room. I kept telling myself I'd make it right someday when it was safe, someday when I had nothing left to lose. And he knelt with difficulty beside a loose floorboard, pried it up with fingers that shook. From beneath, he withdrew a bundle of papers tied with string, yellowed with age but intact. The original records, the true surveys, every document Hollister told me to destroy? He held them out to Caleb, arms trembling with the effort. I couldn't do it. Couldn't burn the only proof of what we'd done. Caleb took the bundle. The paper was soft with age, fragile, but the writing was clear. Names, dates, measurements. The real boundaries, recorded before the lies were built on top of them. Your father's surveys are in there, Whitmore said. The true measurements. He did honest work. They changed it after he filed. Daniel Marsden never knew what they used his name to justify. Relief and rage tangled in Caleb's chest, fighting for dominance. You'll testify? At tribunal? Whitmore sank back into his chair, exhausted by the effort of standing. 6 days. The doctor says I might have 6 days left. He met Caleb's eyes. If I live that long, I'll testify. Every forgery, every bribe, every name. The clock ticked. The light faded. And in that dying room, a man who had spent 40 years running from the truth finally stopped. Let this be my last honest act, Whitmore whispered. Let me die with one clean thing on my conscience. Caleb tucked the bundle inside his coat, close to his chest. 40 years of silence, broken. 40 years of lies, finally ready to see the light. 6 days. They had 6 days to bring down an empire built on stolen ground. The orange glow on the horizon woke him before the smell of smoke reached the cabin. Caleb was on his feet and moving before his mind fully registered what his eyes were seeing. Wrong direction for a brush fire. Too concentrated for lightning strike. The glow pulsed against the night sky like a wound bleeding light. Ayanna. His voice cut through the darkness. Get up, now. She was already moving, pulling on her boots, grabbing her satchel, with the instinct of someone who had learned that everything precious must be kept close. No questions, no hesitation. They'd both survived enough to know what fire on the horizon meant. The horses sensed their urgency, stamping and snorting as Caleb threw on the saddles. The smell of smoke was stronger now, carried on the wind that had shifted from the east, not sage or grass burning. Something else. Something with the acrid bite of kerosene. They rode hard toward town, the horses' hooves pounding against the dry earth. The glow grew brighter as they crested the ridge overlooking Ridgeback Township, and Caleb's stomach dropped when he saw where it was coming from. Whitmore's cabin was engulfed. Flames roared through the dry timber, climbing toward the sky in sheets of orange and red. Sparks exploded upward like swarms of angry fireflies. The heat reached them from 100 yards away, pushing against their faces like a physical force. Townspeople had gathered in the street, their faces lit by the inferno, but no one moved to help. Some watched with expressions of shock, others with something closer to satisfaction. A few simply turned away, unwilling to witness what they couldn't or wouldn't stop. Caleb vaulted from his horse before it stopped moving. Whitmore! He ran toward the cabin, arm raised against the heat. The front wall was already collapsing inward, support beams cracking with sounds like gunshots. Smoke poured from every gap, thick and black and choking. A figure stumbled through the doorway. Soot blackened, coughing, barely upright. Caleb caught Whitmore as the old man's legs gave out, lowering him to the ground away from the heat. The lawyer's nightshirt was singed, his white hair gray with ash. His breath came in wet, rattling gasps that shook his entire frame. They came? Whitmore wheezed. 2 men. Torches. Didn't even try to hide their faces. Ayanna knelt beside them, her expression stricken. The documents. The cabin's roof collapsed with a roar, sending a column of sparks spiraling into the night sky. The root cellar where Whitmore had hidden 40 years of records, the original surveys that proved every lie Hollister had built his empire on. Gone, Ayanna whispered. It's all gone. Whitmore's hand found Caleb's shirt, gripping with surprising strength. His eyes, watering from smoke and exhaustion, found Ayanna's face. Church? The word came out barely audible, lost beneath his coughing. Moved them, yesterday. Caleb leaned closer. What? Knew they'd come. Knew it. Whitmore's grip tightened. Louisa helped. Documents are behind the altar, with the others. Relief crashed through Caleb like a wave breaking over river rocks. He looked at Ayanna, saw the same stunned hope reflected in her eyes. The fire crackled and roared behind them, consuming the empty cabin, destroying nothing but wood and ash. The real evidence was safe, hidden in sacred ground, protected by an old priest and a widow's courage. But as Caleb looked around at the watching townspeople, at the faces illuminated by flames, he understood something else. By morning, every rancher in the territory would hear that Whitmore's records had burned, that the Apache woman's evidence was ash, that the fight against Hollister was over before it had truly begun, which meant Hollister would finally relax, would finally stop looking over his shoulder. And that might be the only advantage they had left. The church smelled of old stone and candle wax and something deeper, the accumulated prayers of generations, soaked into the adobe walls like water into sand. Father Morales dozed in the back pew, his white hair ghostly in the candlelight, undisturbed by their quiet entrance. He was 80 years old if he was a day, nearly blind, but his hearing was sharp enough. He'd known they were coming before they reached the door. The documents are safe, he said without opening his eyes. Behind the altar, as Louisa instructed. I told God they were donations for the poor. A smile crossed his weathered face. He did not argue. They gathered in the sanctuary, Caleb, Ayanna, Whitmore wrapped in blankets Louisa had brought, and Louisa herself, her dark eyes fierce with purpose. 4 people against a territory's most powerful man. 4 voices preparing to speak truth in a land built on lies. The original records spread across the altar like a sacred text. Ayana's treaty documents, Caleb's survey measurements, Whitmore's bundle of true boundaries, and beside them, a list of names, other families who had lost land to Hollister's schemes, Mexican and Apache and white settlers alike, victims who might finally be willing to speak. The territorial inspector arrives in 4 days, Louisa said. Governor's office has been receiving complaints for months. They're looking for evidence of corruption. Evidence. Whitmore's voice was steadier now, though his breathing still rattled. They'll have evidence. Every fraudulent patent I wrote, every bribe Slade paid, every honest survey that was altered after filing. He looked at Caleb. Your father's records will prove the original boundaries. My testimony will prove who changed them. And if they don't believe you? Ayana asked. Your word against Hollister's. Then we give them more than words. Caleb spread his new survey notes on the altar beside his father's journal. I remeasured the disputed land using the original methods. The numbers match exactly. The official records don't come close. Father Morales stirred in his pew. There are others who might speak. The Gutierrez family lost their ranch 3 years ago. The Appletons the year before. They were afraid before, but fear has a way of turning to anger when people see they are not alone. Louisa nodded. I will talk to them, tonight, before word spreads that the evidence burned. The candles flickered, shadows danced across the adobe walls. Outside, the wind carried the smell of smoke from Whitmore's ruined cabin, a reminder of how far their enemies would go. 4 days, Whitmore said. He coughed, pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, studied the red stains when he pulled it away. 4 days might be more than I have, but I'll give you whatever time God allows. Caleb met the old man's eyes. We'll make it enough. Ayana's hand found his in the candlelight. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. He held on, drawing strength from her presence, from the stubborn fire that had kept her clutching that satchel even as the river tried to drag her under. They'd been called traitors and savages and fools. They'd been threatened and watched and nearly burned out. But they were still standing, 4 voices against an empire of lies, 4 days to make them heard. Father Morales rose from his pew, made the sign of the cross, and shuffled toward the altar. I will pray for your success, he said, and I will pray for the souls of your enemies. He paused, a glint of something almost mischievous in his clouded eyes. Though I suspect God will have more work to do with theirs than with yours. The candles burned low. The night deepened, and in the sacred quiet of the old church, 4 people prepared to bring down a kingdom built on stolen ground. The day of the tribunal broke clear and hot, the kind of morning that made men sweat before the sun cleared the horizon. The old Spanish mission ruins sat on the eastern edge of Ridgeback Township, adobe walls open to the sky, crumbling arches casting shadows that had watched over the territory since before the treaties, before the lies, before the land had been divided and sold and stolen. A ramada stretched between 2 standing walls, providing shade for the wooden table where Territorial Inspector Aldridge would sit. Benches filled the courtyard in rough rows, and by the time the sun climbed above the mesa, every seat was taken. They came from miles around. Luisa's Mexican community, women in dark shawls beside men with faces carved by hard labor and harder losses, small ranchers who'd filed patents through Hollister's office, wondering now if their own deeds were lies. Apache who'd traveled from the reservation, their presence a quiet challenge to everyone who claimed this land had been empty before white men arrived, and townspeople. Curious, suspicious, uncertain which way the wind would blow. Caleb stood near the front with Ayana, feeling the weight of all those watching eyes. She wore a traditional dress today, beadwork her grandmother had made, patterns that told stories older than any document Hollister could forge. Her hair was braided tight, her spine straight. She looked like what she was, a woman who had every right to stand here. Whitmore sat on a bench behind them, supported by Father Morales on one side and Luisa on the other. The old lawyer's breathing was shallow, his skin the color of old paper, but his eyes were bright with purpose. 4 days had stretched to this morning through sheer will and stubbornness. Judge Emery Hollister arrived in his finest coat, brushed black wool despite the heat, silver watch chain gleaming across his vest. Vernon Slade walked half a step behind, his coyote smile in place, his hand resting casual near the revolver at his hip. They radiated confidence. Why wouldn't they? The evidence had burned. The Apache woman's documents were ash. The old lawyer was dying, and the rancher was a fool, throwing away everything for nothing. At least, that's what they believed. Inspector Aldridge entered last, a lean man in his 50s, face weathered by years of riding territorial circuits, eyes that had seen every variation of frontier justice and injustice. He carried a leather satchel, thick with papers, and set it on the table, with the weight of authority. The murmuring crowd fell silent. This tribunal is convened, Aldridge said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, to hear the claim of Ayana, granddaughter of Chief Gray Wolf, regarding land patents filed in this territory. He looked directly at Hollister. All parties will have opportunity to speak. The territorial government is watching closely. Hollister stood, smoothing his coat. We're prepared to demonstrate that all patents were properly filed according to... You'll have your chance. Judge Hollister. Aldridge's voice was cold iron. But first, we'll hear the complainant. Ayanna rose. The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like wind through grass. She stepped forward, and Caleb saw her hands trembling. Just slightly, just for a moment, before they steadied. She began in English, clear, precise. The mission school education that had made her people distrust her became her weapon now. My grandfather was promised land by treaty. 40 square miles along the Sibique, surveyed and marked by your government's own men. That promise was broken by men who forged documents for profit, and she produced the original treaty, holding it high enough for everyone to see. The paper was old, fragile, but the signatures were clear. Territorial Governor, Apache Chief, witnessed and sealed. Then she switched to Apache, translating her words for the elders who had made the journey. The language rolled through the courtyard, musical and ancient, a reminder that this land had been named and claimed and loved before English was ever spoken here. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, listening to the sound, if not the meaning. The man who surveyed our land was honest, Ayanna continued, back to English now. His name was Daniel Marsden. The forgeries came after his work was filed. She gestured to Caleb. He stood, bringing forward his father's journal, the survey equipment, the brass plumb bob that caught morning light. I resurveyed the disputed boundary using my father's tools and methods, Caleb said. The true measurements are recorded here. They match the original treaty exactly. And he laid out the comparison, his father's journal, beside his own new measurements, beside the official patents Hollister had filed. The numbers told a story that didn't need translation. Inspector Aldridge examined the documents, his expression hardening with each page he turned. These measurements differ significantly from the official records, he said slowly. Because the official records are forgeries, Ayanna said. Hollister surged to his feet. This is hearsay. The word of me. Whitmore's voice cut through the courtyard, thin but clear. The old lawyer stood, shaking off Father Morales' supporting hand. Every eye turned to watch him shuffle forward, each step an effort, each breath audible in the sudden silence. I wrote those patents, Whitmore said. Every fraudulent one. On Judge Hollister's direct orders, I kept the originals. The crowd erupted, gasps, shouts. Someone standing up, sitting back down. Aldridge pounded his hand on the table for order. Slade's smile finally died. This man is dying, delirious. His testimony is corroborated by physical evidence. Whitmore reached into his coat, moved too fast, and Slade's hand went to his gun. 3 ranchers stood immediately, hands on their own weapons. The air went tight as drawn wire. Whitmore withdrew only papers, the bundle of original records preserved for 40 years. He set them on the table before Aldridge, with the gentleness of a man laying down a burden he'd carried too long. Every document Hollister told me to destroy, Whitmore said. Every honest survey that was altered. Every boundary that was changed to steal land from people who couldn't fight back. His voice strengthened. $20 per filing. That's what he paid me. That's what I sold my conscience for. Aldridge spread the documents across the table. The morning sun fell on them, illuminating the truth in faded ink and careful measurements. Hollister's face had gone from confident to crimson to pale. These allegations are absurd. One dying man's guilt-ridden fantasies are supported by systematic evidence. Aldridge stood. The leather satchel he'd brought opened to reveal more papers, complaints filed with the territorial government, petitions from displaced families, reports from other inspectors. We've been investigating land fraud in this territory for 18 months, Judge Hollister. We just needed someone brave enough to provide proof. He held up one of Whitmore's original records, comparing it to an official patent. These documents don't just prove fraud on Apache land. They prove fraud on every patent filed through your office for more than a decade. The words fell like stones in still water. Ripples spread through the crowd as men looked at each other, realization dawning. The Gutierrez family, the Appletons, the Delgados, they'd all been victims. They'd all filed through Hollister's office. They'd all trusted the system to be fair. How many? Someone shouted from the crowd. How many patents? Aldridge shuffled through the records. Preliminary count, 47 fraudulent filings. Total value approximately $12,000. The courtyard exploded, men on their feet, women crying, voices raised in anger and vindication, in grief for what they'd lost and never thought they'd recover. Hollister backed toward the edge of the ramada. This is a conspiracy. These people have fabricated. Emery Hollister, you are relieved of your position as land commissioner pending criminal investigation. Aldridge's voice cut through the chaos. Vernon Slade, you are under arrest for fraud, arson, and conspiracy. Slade bolted. 3 strides toward where his horse was tied, reaching for the saddle. 2 Mexican ranchers caught him before he made it 5 steps. They drove him into the dust, pinned him there, while his hat rolled away, and his smile, finally, completely, died. Hollister stood frozen, his empire crumbling around him like the mission walls, 12 years of theft and lies undone by an Apache woman who wouldn't let go of a satchel, and a dying man who'd finally found the courage to speak. The territorial marshal stepped forward with iron manacles. The sound of them closing around Hollister's wrists echoed across the courtyard like the door of a cell, slamming shut. Ayanna stood in the center of it all, sunlight falling across her grandmother's beadwork. Her face composed, but her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. Caleb moved to her side. Her hand found his, held tight. Around them, the crowd was transforming, from witnesses to participants, from victims to voices, Mexican families embracing, small ranchers comparing stories, Apache elders nodding slowly, seeing justice delivered not through violence, but through truth spoken in the open air where lies couldn't survive. Whitmore sank back onto his bench, Father Morales catching him before he fell. The old lawyer's face was gray, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But his eyes held something Caleb recognized, peace, the kind of man only finds when he's finally put down a weight he was never meant to carry. The crowd dispersed slowly, like water finding its level after a flood. Men stood in small clusters, comparing stories of lost land and forged documents. Women embraced, tears mixing with dust on their cheeks. The marshal led Hollister and Slade toward the jail, and nobody moved to stop them. Nobody spoke in their defense. Caleb stood apart, watching the sunset paint the mission walls in shades of gold and copper. The smell of dust and sage hung in the warm air, and somewhere a dove called its evening song, his ranch. By every law written on paper, by every truth carved into the land itself, it sat on Apache territory. The patent his father had helped survey was built on the same lie as all the others. He'd known this was coming from the moment Ayanna showed him that map. Known it, accepted it, made his peace with losing the only thing his family had left him. He heard her approach before he saw her. The soft sound of boots on packed earth, the whisper of beadwork against leather. Ayanna wasn't alone. An elder walked beside her, ancient and dignified, wearing the weathered face of someone who'd watched treaties made and broken, who'd seen his people pushed from land to reservation and back again. Greyfeather, Ayanna had called him, her great-uncle, a man who held authority in the clan councils. The elder studied Caleb for a long moment, said something in Apache, words that flowed like water over stone, measured and deliberate. Ayanna translated, "He says the land remembers who treats it with respect. Paper lies, the earth does not." Greyfeather spoke again, gesturing toward the mesa, the creek, the stretch of territory that held both their histories. "My people have discussed your claim," Ayanna said. Her voice was steady, but something moved behind her eyes. "The ranch that sits on our land, the cabin where your family lived and died." Caleb nodded. "I understand. When the patents are voided, you will keep it?" He stopped, stared at her. "What?" She reached into the bundle she carried and withdrew something he recognized immediately. His work shirt, the faded blue one, soft from 100 washings that he'd given her by the river without looking. She'd kept it all this time. Mended the tears, washed the mud from the fabric, folded it carefully like something precious. "A man who gives his covering without looking," she said, pressing the shirt into his hands, "deserves to keep his land." The fabric was warm from her touch. The smell of sage and clean cotton filled his lungs. Greyfeather spoke again. Ayanna's smile was small but real. "My people grant you water rights in perpetuity. The ranch is yours, not by fraudulent paper, but by the law of the heart. You honored my life when you had no reason to. We honor your home because you honored ours." Caleb's throat closed. He looked at the shirt in his hands, at Ayanna's face, at the elder, who watched him with eyes that had seen too much taken and were now choosing to give. "I don't," his voice cracked, "I don't deserve this." No man deserves grace," Greyfeather said in careful English. "But some men earn the right to receive it." The dove called again. The sun slipped lower, and Caleb understood that he'd been given something worth more than any deed filed in any land office. He'd been given a home built not on paper but on trust, on one honest act witnessed and remembered. Whitmore died that night. They gathered around his bed in Father Morales' quarters. Caleb, Ayanna, Luisa, the priest. The old lawyer's breathing had grown shallow through the afternoon, each exhale a little weaker than the last. But his eyes were clear, peaceful. "Did we do right?" he whispered. "We did right," Caleb said. Whitmore smiled, the first real smile Caleb had seen on that weathered face. "Then I can go honest." His chest rose once more, then settled, then was still. Father Morales made the sign of the cross. Luisa wept quietly. And in that small room that smelled of medicine and candle wax, A man who had spent 40 years in shame died in redemption. The next morning, Caleb stood on his porch watching the sun climb above the eastern ridge. The creek ran clear and cold, the same as it always had. The fence line stretched toward the mesa, marking boundaries that now meant something different, something truer. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. She handed him one and stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, watching the land wake up together. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Same as always, I reckon. Mend fences, tend stock, live quiet." "Alone?" He looked at her. She looked back, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "Hoping not," he said. She smiled, took his hand, and together they watched the sun climb higher, burning off the last shadows, illuminating a territory that was learning, slowly, painfully, to tell the truth. The territory remembered that summer differently, depending on who told the story. Some said it was the summer the land office burned, not Whitmore's cabin, but the corruption inside those walls that had been smoldering for a dozen years. Others called it the summer the Apache woman stood at the mission ruins and spoke truth in 2 languages, changing everything without firing a single shot. The newspapers down in Tucson ran headlines about the largest land fraud case in territorial history. 47 families received their deeds back, redrawn with honest boundaries. The governor appointed a new land commissioner who hadn't learned yet that power could be bought and sold, like cattle. Vernon Slade got 10 years in the territorial prison. Judge Hollister got 15 and died halfway through, which some folks said was mercy, and others said wasn't nearly enough. But Caleb Marsden never talked much about any of it. That wasn't his way. He just kept working the ranch along Cibecue Creek, mending fences that would break again come spring, tending stock that would always need tending, living the quiet life his father had started and he'd nearly lost. Only now, the silence had company. Ayanna stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Her people would have welcomed her home with honor and ceremony. She stayed because she chose to. Because a man who turns away and offers his shirt without looking is a man worth building a life beside. They married that fall, when the cottonwoods turned gold and the creek ran cold and clear. Father Morales spoke the words in Latin and Spanish. An Apache elder spoke them in the old tongue. And somewhere between those languages, in the space where 2 worlds touched, they made their promises. Luisa Delgado stood witness wearing her finest shawl, crying the way women cry at weddings, not from sorrow but from joy that's been earned through grief. She'd carried her husband's memory for 6 years, like a stone in her chest. Watching Caleb and Ayanna speak their vows, she felt that stone finally begin to lighten. They buried Samuel Whitmore in the church cemetery, under a headstone that told a truth more important than dates. He died honest. Father Morales said it was the finest epitaph any man could ask for. Caleb reckoned he was right. The land didn't care whose name was written on which paper. It never had. It cared who walked it with respect, who worked it fair, who understood that ownership wasn't about deeds filed in dusty offices, but about showing up every morning and doing what needed doing. Caleb understood that now. So did Ayanna. They planted a garden that first spring together. Corn and beans and squash in the Apache way, planted together because they grew stronger side by side. The surveying tools went back in their trunk, the brass plumb bob wrapped careful in oilcloth, saved for some future day when truth would need measuring again. The shirt Ayanna had returned to him hung on a peg by the door, mended where it had torn, soft where the river had tried to destroy it. Some mornings Caleb would touch it in passing, remembering the day he'd given it away without looking back, never knowing what that single act of decency would return to him. Some debts are paid in gold. Some are paid in blood, but the ones that matter most, those are paid in trust, built slow and careful, one honest act at a time. The West wasn't made for weak hearts, but it made room eventually for people who understood that home isn't where you stake your claim. Home is where someone chooses to stay, morning after morning, building something together that no forged document could ever take away. The creek runs clear, the sun climbs high. And 2 people who'd lost everything found what the territory couldn't steal, a place to stop running and a reason to stay